So everyone's enjoying the heat wave, going to the beach, having ice cream. Although, imagine it got a little bit hotter, and a little bit hotter again, and a little bit hotter again. Would we face crop failures? Would farmers go out of business? Would there be food on the supermarket shelves? Would our crumbling Victorian water system be able to provide people with water? And in the last quarter, we've had record heat and record snow. But we're not going to stop climate change in a society driven by profit. Climate deniers and conspiracy theorists have a hero in the White House at the moment because Trump is anti-science. Despite the fact that 97% of scientists agree that we face climate change and that climate change and climate chaos is going to be even more of a problem over the next few decades, and that it even represents an existential threat to the survival of the human species. And the last 17 or 18 years have had 16 or 17 of the warmest temperatures on record. Scientists are warning that 1 million species face extinction. But although Trump and his anti-science nonsense rhetoric gets a round of applause from the oil companies, the green capitalists aren't that much better. Their claims that capitalism, if it goes green, will save the planet is nothing but liberal PR spin. Headlines like the death of King Coal hide the fact that CO2 actually has increased. They boast about the fact that the increase in CO2 emissions has lowered to 0.6 a year. I mean, that's like saying the car is heading towards a cliff. But don't worry, because I'm only accelerating by 0.6. I mean, that's not quite the same thing as coming to a stop. And an increase of 0.6 represents 127 million metric tons of petroleum, which still equals about 206 times the consumption of renewables. Trump is arguing for support for more coal and the coal industry in the USA. US coal is being burned around the world. I mean, there are 400 new coal stations in Southeast Asia alone. You see, we live in a globalised economy. Western corporations, like for example Swedish corporations, might boast about cutting their CO2 emissions, but then they farm out production of their goods to Southeast Asia, where the electricity is provided by CO2 emitting coal burning stations. So the Western corporations can spin a positive green image while they pollute somewhere else. And on a global scale, this output of CO2 is still going to cause a disaster for us all. They're so short-term and profit-minded that they can't see what's coming. I mean, US oil consumption has gone up, and even in countries where there has been a fall in CO2, some of it can be accounted for by the global economic crash of 2008. I mean, that knocked back production and meant there was less electricity, less building, less of everything. So it wasn't as if our governments implemented these great green policies. I mean, there is a green economy, and some corporations have decided to try and benefit from the tax breaks available from government. And they understand there's a bit of a market for green products. But according to the IMF, subsidies to the oil companies and fossil fuel companies are still about $5.3 trillion a year. That's still many times over the subsidies to so-called green corporations. And then they say maybe new technologies like electric cars will save us. But hang on a minute, if the car runs on electricity, how is that electricity generated? If it's generated in a coal burning plant, then the car's hardly going to save us by itself, is it? And then they say they've got new technologies where they can capture CO2 from the atmosphere, turn it into liquid and bury it underground. That they could put 100 million barrels a day underground. Now the only problem with that is, that's as much production of oil as the global oil industry has done day in, day out for 100 years. Now who is going to invest in a global infrastructure to undertake such a project? Nobody. Nobody's going to make that investment. So it's a fantasy. We're hurtling towards catastrophe, and capitalism can't stop being capitalism. And talking about green cars or individualised consumer alternatives avoids the argument about whether or not we need public transport. At every turn, neoliberalism undermines our ability to tackle climate change. We've only 2 or 3 years left till we pass a 1.5 degree rise. Another couple of degrees beyond that and crops start failing. People start fleeing their countries because the economy has collapsed. In Greek legend, there was a woman called Cassandra who was cursed by the gods She was given the power to foresee the future, but they cursed her because they made it so that no one would believe her predictions of the future. Now those in power, in the establishment and the corporations, aren't ignoring those of us and the 97% of scientists who are predicting climate chaos and climate change because they're cursed. They're ignoring us because it cuts against the profit motive. And there it is. That's what's on the scales. On the one hand, you've got the profit motive. On the other hand, you've got the future of the human race. People need to come before the profits of the corporations.